morning, everyone. Thanks a lot for coming here. Some of you even before me. And again, thank you very much, Sanya and Gazela, for inviting me. So, as Gazela said, I come from the University of Edinburgh and just started a new job in Edinburgh. I used to work for UCL for the last 2 years, and we've been cooperating in different projects with Gazela, Sanya, Adriana, and they are the reason why I get to come and enjoy the nice weather and movements more often than necessary sometimes. So my presentation today is going to be about modern citizenship struggles and the impossible choice between cultural recognition and socioeconomic justice in Southeast Europe. The first part of the presentation will be in general about theories of citizenship, as well as this distinction between cultural recognition and identity politics on the one hand, and then socioeconomic justice and social and economic rights in general. And then the last part will look how this tension works in the case of Southeast Europe largely, although mostly I'll be focusing on the case of the former Yugoslavia. So I think, and yeah, please feel free to interrupt me whenever you have a question or you think I'm going too fast or there is something that is not very clear about the presentation. So I think it's quite important to start from the very basic premise that the modern state, the whole idea of modern state, is based on some sort of politics of inclusion and exclusion. And as you will see in the course of the presentation, both inclusion and exclusion work at different layers and different levels of the modern politics, starting from the international relations all the way to the nation state, but also even further down when we break down the concept of citizenship and membership in various polities. And also we will be looking at the issue of multi-level citizenship and how that affects the rights and access of different categories of populations in that respect. So when you talk about inclusion and exclusion, I think it's important to remember that both the idea of the nation, which is a very modern and dominant concept in politics, but also in real life, are somehow confined, and borders are a quintessential element in the distinction between us and them, this state and that state, this territory and that territory. So here are just some of the definitions both about citizenship and about the nation and nation state. So, as Gezim put it, so nation is a border power container. So we're speaking about power in the form of political power, but also we're speaking about borders, and that's very important. Wherever you have a border, you have inclusion and exclusion, because the ones who are inside of the border, they are the ones who are included, and then the border is there to exclude the others who are not wanted. And usually it's foreigners, but also, as you can see, it can be migrants, it can be minorities within the confines of the nation state. Similarly, Brubaker defines citizenship as a social closure. Again, we're talking about the more socioeconomic dimension of citizenship, but how it's closed to the outsiders, and as a result, access to many rights is limited only to the people who are within the borders. So, nation state and citizenship, both of them have this dual capacity to include and to exclude. So historically, if we see how the concept of citizenship has emerged, so it has been limited to the state-holding groups or nations. So always, or in the majority of cases, you would have one ethnic group or national group who would be considered as the owner of that specific state, and often the rights were limited. But then the limitation of rights goes also across gender, across social groups. So for example, if we talk about political participation of women in the modern state, so it's only until the 20th century when most of the states would open up the political space for women to be, first of all, to have the right to vote, but also to stand for election. But most importantly, I think also in the context of this presentation, is this the principles of inclusion and exclusion, how they are limited to ethnic and linked to ethnic and national forms of exclusion. And these are like some of the last two quotes here, probably are the most pessimistic one about democracy and modern nation states. So one comes from middle, the tyranny of the majority. So wherever you have the idea of a state organized on the basis of the will of the majority, actually we're talking about the tyranny of the majority, because always the majority will be in a position to impose its will on everyone within the borders of the nation state, including minorities of various groups. And then we have Michael Mann's book on the dark side of democracy, which is quite a fascinating book about the origins of the modern state and how he claims that most of the states in the world today became democratic by using very sinister ways, including oppression, assimilation, ethnic cleansing, and even genocide.
What is the name of the book, sir?
It's The Dark Side of Democracy. That's the title of the book as well. So now, focusing more narrowly on the issue of citizenship. So citizenship is mostly about membership. It's about membership in a certain political entity, or it's a legal link between one individual on the one hand and then a state or an entity on the other hand. Probably the most famous definition about citizenship is citizenship as a full and equal membership in a political community. So it's by T.H. Marshall, whose work is seminal in citizenship studies. However, although the definition is quite simple and logical, I think in the real world things are much more complex because it raises so many questions. The first one is who has the right to have a political community or a state? So we're talking about state and individuals on the other hand, but who has the right to have a state? Is it national minorities? Is it nations? Who is a nation? Who is not a nation? How do we choose where the right to citizenship or to own a political community ends? Or, as Hannah Arendt put it, this is a meta right, so the right to have rights. So everything starts with that. So it's you either have the right or not, and again, who decides who has the right to exercise certain rights or to have certain rights. And then we have a more practical questions: who can be a member within a polity? So we have a polity. Let's suppose we created the state, but then we have to decide who belongs to the state. Is it open to everyone, so that everyone, we had discussion yesterday also about migration, and so does everyone have the right to go and claim membership in a polity, or we set specific rules? And every state in the world has some sort of citizenship legislation, which is key to state building because it sets the rules of inclusion, exclusion, but also naturalization. So how a foreigner can go to that country and then claim residence and even naturalization to full citizenship so that he can be an equal member of the state. And clearly states have different understandings of that, but also different rules. As regards the different concepts, so in the literature there are two main models of citizenship. So one is the German, the other is the French. So Brubaker has done a lot of work on this, but I think Walzer's description is quite simple and interesting because he says that the French model is, the German model is a family model, so you're born in Germany, and we heard yesterday from the presentation how Germany until very recently didn't allow naturalization of foreigners. So if you were German from Soviet Union, you didn't speak a single word of German, but you could claim German ancestry, you could become a German citizen. But if you were a child of Turkish parents and you were born there and grew up there, until quite late you couldn't become a German citizen. Or you have the opposite, which is the French political club. So basically you decide to join the political club if you agree with the rules of that, so it's more open. We know that in practice it's not that simple, but I think these were for quite some time considered to be the two opposing models of organization. Today I think if you see different rules of naturalization, you would understand that most of the states actually combine these two models when it comes to the citizenship laws, because on the one hand they give primacy to ethnic categories or the titular nations especially, but then often they would provide some sort of forms for naturalization of foreigners and gradual integration within the polity. But the national citizenship, as understood originally, so basically the tie between the titular nation and the state, was gradually challenged both from the bottom by marginalized groups who demanded recognition, and we're talking about different sorts of recognition here, but also from the top through the surpassing of the state and as a result of the globalization. So these pressures came from different levels, But I think as a result of these two pressures, there have been a lot of changes. So on the one hand, citizenship and political participation had to be opened to many groups, and then that's why we started talking about the politics of recognition, multiculturalism, but also different forms of recognition and redistribution, as we'll discuss later, but also as a result of this multi-level citizenship. For example, the best example is the European Union. So you're a dual citizenship. You're a citizen of a member state of the European Union, but at the same time you're also a citizen of the European Union. And as a citizen of European Union, you have certain rights in terms of voting rights in local elections, the right to settle anywhere you want within the European Union, and also the right to work. But again, even this one is challenged, as we saw recently with the case of Brexit, so it's not a straightforward thing. There's been a lot of debate about people from other parts of Europe going to Britain, claiming the right to work, but also in few cases claiming benefits, but unfortunately the issue of benefits became a dominant discourse in the British politics and British media recently. So as a result of these pressures and challenges, I think what we have seen in the last decades is a re-evaluation of the link between state citizenship and belonging. And this happens at different levels, not only at the level of ethnic politics and ethnic recognition, but also when it comes to the issue of race, gender, and other forms of difference which are quite important in the contemporary political debates today. So probably the biggest challenge has been that of the myth of ethnic and cultural neutrality of liberal individual citizenship, because many proponents of the Western models of political organization would claim that Western states are so democratized that they are neutral, so they provide with rights for everyone who is a member and don't discriminate. And clearly, in most of the cases, this is a myth, because every single state, even states like the United States of America, Australia, which are migrant nation states, they have some sort of myth foundation. So they speak about the fathers of the nation, and usually they are white European, mostly North European or West European, despite the fact that males. Absolutely, that's the other aspect. Yeah, so it's we don't talk about female until the 20th century. So, and the other, I think this opened also the debate about how do we hold rights or how do we exercise rights? Do we do it individually or as a group? And I think this is where the whole literature on the idea of political recognition and recognition of difference with people like Taylor, Young, and others who became quite popular because they challenged this myth and they started speaking about the need to recognize certain group rights. So in addition to being an equal member of a polity, certain communities might need to have group rights to really flourish within the confines of the political community, or just to keep certain traditions or cultural differences in terms of language and other cultural issues. The other stream, the more ideologically predominant stream, is the one that takes group differentiated rights to a completely different level. So here we have again two sub sections in the literature. So one is the famous multicultural citizenship, Kimrika's concept, and I think probably the main critic of this concept, and I'm sure all of you have opinions about multicultural citizenship, is that it's very biased. So because Kimrika claims that the precondition for any sort of multicultural citizenship is to have a liberal state. So historically, we have seen that that's not the case. So some of the multicultural citizenship models, which were very efficient, have been produced outside of the liberal Western states. Clearly, Yugoslavia is one of the examples how you had a state organized on the principles of socialism on the one hand, but also on the principle of national and ethnic equality on the other hand. It was quite an interesting balance between the two, although it wouldn't qualify according to Kimrika's concept of being a liberal multicultural state. And then we have the more extremely communitarian idea, which claims that the group rights should be taken even to further extremes, because only by being members of a group we can realize our potentials fully. And I think these two concepts were very instrumental in pushing various minorities to claim minority rights in the form of group rights. And then if you see the case of Southeast Europe, this has been mostly the predominant political struggle since the fall of socialism, especially after '91, where issues about status of the group, about domination, so whether you're a national minority or a nation, whether you're an ethnic group or a community, have been very, very important. However, I think what's important to remember is that when we talk about minority rights, although minorities claim that they are referring to rights because they want to be equal or fully integrated within the state citizenship, as Magnet says, actually what minorities are demanding is withdrawal from common citizenship. And this is quite fascinating because the language is the same, so they mirror the language of the dominant group, but actually what they want is not like full integration mostly, but it's separation. And then separation can take different forms. So it can be linguistic segregation, it can be in the form of territorial autonomy where you carve out a bit of territory within one dominant country and you want to make sure that the dominant national group has no access there or the state authorities have no access there. I think one good example would be Macedonia, when after the conflict, one of the key issues was the issue of language in Macedonia, and now 15 years after the Ohrid Agreement, what has this model produced basically is further segregation, because the Albanian community, now most of the people, young people, don't speak any Macedonian, so they have acquired certain rights, including the right to education in Albanian, all the way up to university, but on the other hand, there is no incentive or initiative to also learn Macedonian language and be more integrated within state institutions. So I think, this is not a formula how things work, but the imposition of certain concepts by Western policy builders in the Balkans, based on the idea of multicultural citizenship, but also group differentiated rights, combined with the lack of vision by local elites in the Balkans, has produced this quite perverse results, which I think are problematic in many respects. So, as I said, there has been some sort of hegemony of cultural politics in post-socialism. And because, again, so the main struggle has been, and I think this is not very typical only for post-socialism, because if you see even the Cold War period, there has been this big struggle between the two blocs, the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc. On the one hand, there was the struggle for civil and political rights, supported by all the Western states who claimed that it's essential for every individual everywhere in the world to be free, to speak freely, to participate in elections, and to choose who are their political representatives. And on the other hand, we had what are known as the Eastern Bloc or the communist countries, who gave primacy to social, economic, and cultural rights. And again, this is also a normative debate on whether which sets of rights take precedence. But I think there was quite a big switch as a result of the fall of the Berlin Wall. So most, especially in the case of Southeast Europe, the identity politics took precedence over socioeconomic and cultural rights. And I think this is the case even today. There has been little debate, little struggle, little talk about the problems related to socioeconomic situation in the region, although, as you might know, most of the problems today in the region stem not from the status, ethnic status, or issues related to majority and minority communities, but it's mostly to the very dire socioeconomic situation. So I think normatively there has been this attempt to bridge the two sets of rights, and probably one of the most famous concepts here is Nancy Fraser's critical theory of recognition, where she claims that in addition to providing for cultural and group recognition, we need to talk also about redistribution. And redistribution is understood quite broadly in this sense. It's not only in terms of socioeconomic, but it's also in terms also in terms of opportunities that are offered to different categories within the confines of the modern nation state. So according to Fraser, what we have seen after the fall of socialism is group identity supplanting class interests. So we'll just keep talking about groups and the rights and the status of various groups, some more old, some older, some newer, newly constructed ethnic and national categories. And then we have also seen cultural domination supplanting exploitation. So basically we haven't seen any substantial debate about exploitation that was becoming a very, very grave problem after the fall of socialism throughout the region. And finally, cultural recognition displacing socioeconomic distribution. So again, there has been a major transformation process in terms of how economies function after 91, but there has been little debate how the profit and the wealth and the goods are being redistributed or not distributed at all in the region. So I have one more slide about theories, and I'll move to hopefully the more interesting part about how this plays in the context of Southeast Europe. I just going to briefly refer to Brubaker's new book about grounds for difference, which I think is quite fascinating in many ways. So I started Brubaker extensively because I also know the field of nationalism, and he's written extensively on nationalism, citizenship, and other related issues. But I think his new book is quite important because, again, he somehow brings back certain debates which we would take for granted, but then he provides new insights into what we think are the old problems, and the results are quite fascinating in many ways. I think what he does in his recent book is basically talking about the return of inequality, but not inequality only in economic and social terms per se, but actually what he's trying to do is trying to see how certain forms of difference, ethnic, gender difference, cultural, as well as difference in terms of citizenship, can actually have a huge impact on the reproduction of inequality in today's world. And his approach is quite global, often is mostly concentrated in the United States where he lives and works, but I think it's very important in understanding this dynamics between difference in recognition of difference on the one hand, and how that feeds inequality on the other hand. So what he does basically is trying to reconnect structural sources of inequality with cultural dimension of difference, if we put it in his words. So if we look at this issue of citizenship, which again for him is one of the most important issues, so there are two levels, the internal level within the state, and as I said, there are different ways of looking how citizenship functions within the state. So it is the case of the US where he says that we have different categories. We have citizens, we have immigrants, and we have also undocumented migrants. And there are more than 10 million undocumented migrants in the US. So technically, because they live there, they work there, they create families there, they belong to the US, but legally they don't belong. The US is not the only case where you have huge numbers of people who are undocumented migrants, and basically they are at the lower level of the social strata and political strata within the state. But what is most importantly in his argument is that the external level of citizenship is more problematic in terms of the reproduction of inequality. And this is for a very simple fact, because today in the world you have a clear hierarchy of values of various citizenships of different states. And then here we can explain this by looking at different interpretations about how the world of nation states works today. So we can refer to Castell's citizenship hierarchy. So he says that clearly we have a hierarchy in the world. If you are a US citizen, you are not equal to being a citizen of Somalia, for example. Although you're a member of a nation state, but because of the prestige, power, and wealth of the US and its domination within the existing world order, you're completely disadvantaged as a non-US, or let's say as a citizen of a small, impoverished country, or as Sashar or Sakar, I don't know how you pronounce it, put it, we speak about the birthright lottery. So basically he says that one of the biggest ironies of the modern form of citizenship and political organization is that basically our prospects in lives and the level of rights we're going to enjoy is like a lottery. So if you're lucky enough to be born in a developed country, then your prospects in life will be much better regardless of your capacities in that respect. Or I think there are other ways to look at this, especially when we focus more on the issue of socioeconomic relations in the world. So well-established world system theory, so we can speak about core, periphery, and then semi-periphery. And I think this really works also in the context of citizenship. You have a core of Western countries which are very powerful politically and also economically, and as a result their citizens are privileged in many respects. And then you have the semi-periphery, the more developing countries who have some sort of prestige at a regional level, or because of their economic wealth or good relations with other states, you might have certain advantages in terms of being a citizen of that state. And then we have the real periphery, which is mostly non-European, underdeveloped, impoverished, and war countries which are going through wars, such as the countries in the Middle East. Or, as the Cambridge economist Chang put it, so actually what we're seeing today, he says it's not only that we are incapable of bridging the gap between the more advantaged country in terms of economic well-being, but actually he's saying what the big countries are doing, they're in his work kicking away the ladder for the smaller countries. So they say, well, you can climb, you can come to where we are now, but whenever you're trying to climb, they impose on you certain economic policies that pretty much make it impossible for you to develop and come to a stage where you could be a country that can guarantee some prosperity to its citizens. So, to explain it more graphically, this is it's called
pre-Brexit. Pre-Brexit. Because United Kingdom
Well, it's still not.
So this is I think it's the World Passport Index, it's called. They do studies and they see which are the most powerful passports. And I think this doesn't need any comment, because so it just shows that there is a clear correlation between the passport, the power of a passport, and the economic and political power of a nation. So basically, you have UK, US, Germany, South Korea, France, Italy, Sweden, Singapore, which is an exception, but still having in mind its financial resources and being a big center. So these are all the most powerful passports in the world. I think the numbers here suggest the number of countries you can visit without a visa, which is not a small thing, because basically your freedom of movement is much more meaningful and powerful than that of so many other states in the world. And then we have here the bottom list. So again, it's, you have Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Somalia, Syria, Libya, Eritrea, and Ethiopia. So the number of countries they can visit without a visa is very small, and it's mostly regional countries or countries where their citizens wouldn't go because they are equally problematic. So I think this is quite important to see figuratively how socioeconomic position of a country also reflects in terms of the status as a citizen of that country and opportunities you will have in the future. I'll skip this one. And then the case of Southeast Europe, I think the term itself is quite problematic because it can be wide, it encompasses many things, but probably the starting point in many ways, especially in the context of our discussion today, would be socialism. And I think socialism is important because it's a common thread for many countries, but also I think if you look further, if you look deeper into how socialism functioned in the region, you could see that in addition to many commonalities in the region, there were also so many differences or different paths to socialism. So again, when we talk about Southeast Europe, today in the dominant political discourse, we refer to it as the Eastern Bloc, totalitarian states, Soviet Bloc, Warsaw Pact, and these are terms not used only by journalists and people who have superficial knowledge, but sometimes problematic, also by scholars who would want to create this very gray, unified picture about the whole region. And I think what's important here is this, when we talk about different paths to socialism, because even in the context of Southeast Europe, a relatively small region in the world context, there were so many different paths. From Yugoslavia's mixed economy, to Albania's complete isolation, to Czechoslovakia's opening with the world in the 60s and 70s, even Hungary's experiment with the new economic mechanism, or as it was called, the goulash communism in Hungary. And I think they produce different results and are quite important in understanding today's struggles, both in terms of citizenship, but also, more importantly, in terms of the socioeconomic situation of the problems that these countries face. And then we have a communalities, so one-party system, and even here you had different levels of desalinization, different levels of oppression. Some countries allowed difference, they also allowed alternatives in the context of culture and music and literature. Some suppressed everything. But I think what's important here is the four latter communalities. So one is intense industrialization. Many regions in these states were completely poor and impoverished after the First World War, but even after Second World War. High literacy rates, and this was the standard across the region. Then you have free education, healthcare, and housing. And I think if you see Rijeka, either from the bottom or from the top here, I think it's quite fascinating how the town developed. And if you know a bit about the socialist architecture or socialist modernist architecture, you could really notice the patterns of developments of the city. And again, Rijeka is not the capital city of Croatia, it was not the capital city of Yugoslavia, but still there was huge investment in terms of developing housing all across the region. And then also the issue of modernization and emancipation. And then I think what causes the problems that we have today is the 1980s crisis and the post-89 disaster. So it was mostly political, but also with huge socioeconomic consequences. So the first crisis, it started, so it was a world crisis with the economic crisis and pressures because of the oil crisis elsewhere, but also pressures in terms of failures to get cheaper loans, but also to pay back the debts that some countries had. And I think then the biggest external shock which shook the system, as we all know, is the fall of Berlin Wall, which happened because of certain dynamics and developments within the Soviet Union, with Gorbachev, who used to be a more liberal voice within the Soviet Union, and then also this opened the opportunity for other countries to pursue their independent paths. But I think the most important and horrible consequence has been the imposition of the structural adjustment programs by international financial institutions on the countries who are undergoing a transition. And this meant that the economy should be shook completely, should be changed the way it functions, and mostly this was done in the form of shock therapy, so that the famous Chicago school, so they employed many of these economists who thought that everything that existed before should be dismantled, everything should be privatized, because this is the path to economic development and well-being of these countries. 25 years on, and we've seen that it didn't turn out to be that way, and the consequences have been quite great, especially because this logic of changing things has led to privatization, unemployment, plunder of public goods, soaring inequalities, and decreasing life standards, and this is across the region. I think the best way to see here what happened after 91 is this, it's a graph, it shows how the GDP was developing in these countries in socialism. And I think this also contradicts many people who claim that there was no genuine economic development in socialism, because if we see here all the point to 90, so there was a progressive economic growth all across the region. You have differences in terms of countries. Some were more, their economies were stronger and they were progressing faster, and then some were weaker. But what we see here is in 1990, a sharp decrease in terms of GDP rise across the region. And I think this is still the region is suffering the consequences of this development in the region. and as I said, this is because basically we stopped talking about issues of social and economic equality, about lack of redistribution, and about other related issues. Instead, we, and when I'm saying we, it's the region in general, they were somehow forced to buy into this story that quick privatization and deregulation basically will produce an economic miracle in the region. And the other problem is that what has happened is that these countries, and some of them, we know in the case of Yugoslavia, were very much in favor of the idea of independence. So everyone wanted to be independent. But I think if you see this, it shows how independent these countries are today. So this is the market share of foreign banks in the countries. And you don't need any more examples to explain how independent these countries are. So basically the blue here explains the share of foreign banks, and that's basically the capital within the countries. And you see it can go all the way to 90% in terms of the capital they hold in different countries, including Croatia. So most of the capital today in these countries, it's foreign capital, and it's not only foreign, because it could have been regional, but it's mostly capital of big banks and corporations from Western Europe. So I think this, it just reproduces itself as a pattern. So the Southeast Europe has now remained somewhere in semi-periphery, including the countries who are part of the European Union. They had some advantages, but again, in terms of economic well-being, I think they are somewhere between periphery and semi-periphery in the larger world system. Yes?
Will you find something significantly different in Western European states in terms of capital ownership?
Well, in Germany, I don't think American banks own 70% of capital in German banks. Or Korean banks or Japanese banks in Germany. And I think that makes a difference.
German banks own German capital and Austrian banks own Austrian capital.
So that's a significant difference, because when the economic crisis happened in 2008, what we saw, for example, Raiffeisen Bank, which is very present in Southeast Europe, so they are an Austrian bank. So the first instinctive reaction of a bank when a crisis hits is to withdraw all the capital to the center. Because you don't care that you close some branches there somewhere outside of your center, but it's important that the capital goes back to the center, because you don't want to risk any big losses.
Yes, that's what happened in Argentina. The state was totally destroyed.
And I'm not saying that this is very typical only for Southeast Europe, because there are many regions in the world which might be even worse than Southeast Europe. I'm just saying how this, it's not a very pure financial thing. I think it has a lot of bearing on socioeconomic well-being of citizens in these countries. So I think basically the final concluding remark would be in the form of a question. So, and I think here we can open a debate, we can discuss about the presentation in general, but most importantly about the topic. So, well, there's a mistake here, sorry. So how to figure out how to conceptualize cultural recognition and social equality in forms that support rather than undermine one another. So is it possible that we find a model or a form where there should be some sort of equality between cultural recognition on the one hand and social equality on the other hand, because they are very intimately tied to each other, and what happens in one dimension affects the other as well. And as we saw, so equality and inequality, again, it's all I spoke most about the economic inequality. It's not only economic, it can be again gender, and I know probably Adriana is pissed off that I didn't speak more about the problem of gender inequality. But I think this remains an extremely difficult choice, political choice in the region. Also normative is quite problematic, but I think it's probably that it forms the crux of the problems today in the region, and this is, in my opinion, this is the main dilemma that the region has today, because so much attention has been paid to cultural recognition. Even today, you see what's happening between Serbia and Croatia, our national minority, what you did do during the war, the position of this group, of that group, we have more rights, we have less rights. while there is no talk about these more significant problems and issues related to inequality, which I think affect everyone regardless of the ethnic, national, or the sexual belonging. And I'll stop here and I will welcome any questions and comments. Thank you very much. Yes?
Yeah, I completely agree with this notion about, let's say,